At this time, I would like to introduce our special panel, and really thankful for all of them that you could join, because this is really critical. The idea is these are professionals that NC CASC work directly with to kind of develop approaches to addressing the issue of how to bring climate change into assessing impacts and developing adaptation strategies. So in the order of what they might go today, I'll introduce them. I'll start with Brian Miller, who is a research ecologist with the USGS, with the US Geological Survey and the North Central CASC. At North Central CASC, Brian is leading the development of ecological simulation modeling and scenario planning tools that inform resource management under climate change. Next, we have John Ganot, who is a spatial ecologist with the US Fish and Wildlife Service in its Ecological Services Program based out of the Legacy Region 6 office in Lakewood, Colorado. John assists Fish and Wildlife Service field offices with analytical, geospatial, and statistical needs for listing or delisting species under the Endangered Species Act's species status assessments. Also from Fish and Wildlife Service, we have Alex Caston, who is a species assessment team project manager with the Ecological Service Program of the Fish and Wildlife Service. She also works out of the regional office in Lakewood, Colorado. She leads different teams of biologists crafting species status assessments to inform classification decisions under the Endangered Species Act. And also from US Fish and Wildlife Service is Amy Crittenden, who is a biologist at the service. She's at the Western Colorado Ecological Services field office, where her work focuses on federally threatened and endangered species listing and recovery. And finally, we have Amber Runyon, who is an ecologist with the National Park Service and in their climate change response program, where she collaborates with park managers to provide management relevant projections of future climate that serve as the basis for climate informed planning. And so I welcome our panelists. And a little bit on the agenda, I'll go through some introductory remarks, talk about the motivation of this session, and then hand it over to Brian, who will discuss scenario planning approaches out there, just the concept of scenario planning. And then I'll hand over to our panelists from the Fish and Wildlife Service to talk about the climate applications work they're doing for the species status assessment work in the Region 6. And that's kind of coincide with the NC CASC regions. And finally, we'll hand over to Amber to go over the work done at the Park Service. And we hope to have about 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A period, so we can hopefully have some great discussion at that point. So I really want to begin with challenges that practitioners face in applying climate change information to assessing impacts to natural and cultural resources. These challenges arise from a variety of reasons. Foremost among them is the uncertainty associated with projections in future climate change, and so there's a huge spread in what the future climate could look like, and how to kind of deal with it, how to incorporate that part. The second challenge comes from the complexity that's inherent in both the climate and the ecological processes, and also our lack of understanding of some of those complexities, and especially of the interaction between the climate and biological processes. And finally, and quite important, the challenge as associated with constraints from the availability of relevant climate and biological data at appropriate spatial and temporal scales. So, so given these challenges, how do we do a robust assessment of impacts from a rapidly changing climate. So at least some of our partners in the North Central CASC region have been applying what we call the scenario-based approaches. So, which are both qualitative and quantitative in nature, but bringing in expertise and bringing participation from diverse group of experts to really incorporate uncertainty in climate projections, assess plausible impacts to resources, and identify robust conservation and adaptation strategies. I do want to point out that we have been doing work for several years now, and we've been publishing material on it. And more recently, we have all these publications that's coming out of our team from the Park Service and from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a great resource, great amount of resource that's kind of building up. And this is just a small flavor of some of these papers that have come out. And Jane's just putting these papers in the chat box. So at this point, I will stop and I will ask Brian to please take it away.
Great, sure thing. Thanks, MTS. Let me pull up my screen here, or pull up my slides. And how does that look? Do you just see a title slide there?
I see the whole thing. It's in presentation mode. Looks great.
Presentation mode. Okay. So you see like
at the title slide. Yes.
Just the title slide. Without the notes.
Yes. No
okay.
Notes.
Perfect. Okay. Good. Well, hey. Well, first off, thanks MTS for inviting me, organizing this session, and also just wanted to thank Jane and Bill and Dawn and others from the CU team at NC CASC who've been putting together the events this week. I think it's really been going well, and been enjoying the session. So thanks to y'all for doing that work. So yeah, MTS asked me to come and speak as part of this panel, but largely just to some of the broad concepts of scenario planning and kind of how it can be applied to climate adaptation and resource management. And I'll just spend, it's like 5 minutes or so doing that. So it's going to be very brief, but I think hopefully useful, especially to some of you. I know in the Menti poll that MTS ran there at the beginning, some folks are not particularly familiar with scenario planning. And so I think the idea here is just to get everybody conceptually, at least on the same footing, to kind of understand what we mean when we talk about it. So anyway, that's the goal here for the next 5 minutes or so. And then I'll pass it along to the next presenter and hopefully some good discussion. So I think, we're many of you or all of you are probably have seen or familiar with these kinds of figures. This is just a plot of global mean temperature from the IPCC report from last year. And the main message here is one of uncertainty. When we look to the future of climate change, of course, broad agreement in continued warming, but the magnitude of that warming is quite uncertain, particularly when we look much further out toward the end of the century. And that uncertainty comes from a bunch of different sources, some of which is from our societal choices about how we produce and use energy and transportation and so on. But the main thing is that, yeah, there's climate uncertainty. And if we're interested in the ecology or hydrology of a place, you can imagine that uncertainty is compounded by maybe limitations in data or knowledge of how species or hydrology might respond to these conditions. And, on the other hand, we might say, well, this is global mean temperature, we can get more locally relevant and detailed information. And that's absolutely true. Here's just an example plot of some data that have been downscaled and bias corrected for a specific place for Fort Collins. But we still see a similar kind of a message in the sense that there is still a fair amount of uncertainty, and in this case, how much annual mean temperature might change. And if we look at another variable like precipitation, you could argue that uncertainty is even more profound, and that we can't confidently speak to the direction of change, let alone the magnitude. So, these future changes present us with a conundrum. On the other hand, we know that climate change is here. It's bringing conditions that are unfamiliar, hard to fully sort of anticipate and prepare for. And so really we're in this situation which I think Gary Larson here has nicely captured, where we could feel like, well, okay, we're facing this big challenge of climate change, but when we look at the best available climate information, it can feel like we're sort of lost. We're sort of not sure on exactly which directions things are going to go. So how could we really make an informed choice about that? But I think through a lot of research and development that we've been doing, and by we, I'm talking about others at NC CASC, and particularly folks at the Climate Change Response Program within National Park Service, like Amber, who will speak here in a little bit. We've been developing ways to deal with this uncertainty in a way that's productive and for resource management, and that's scenario planning. So let me give you a flavor for what it's like. And I like to start out by reminding people that we make decisions under uncertainty all the time. This isn't a new thing for us as humans. Some of them are perhaps more trivial than others, but I think intuitively we're familiar with the concept of considering divergent plausible futures that we could face and thinking about, if I make this decision and the world turns out this way versus this way, how am I going to fare? And that's essentially what scenario planning is. Now, of course, we've developed more formal processes and concepts for how to do it and why to do it. But in its essence, scenario planning is a framework to support decisions under these uncertain and largely uncontrollable conditions, which is very fitting for something like climate change. And this stands in contrast to a more forecast-based approach where we'd say, here's the future, the one future that we expect, let's plan for that. Instead, we think about what are the divergent range of possible conditions we could face and how do we plan around those multiple different futures. And the scenarios themselves, I mean, we throw around this word a lot. Sometimes it's used relating to emissions scenarios and representative concentration pathways. In this case, we're really talking about scenarios as storylines about how the world might turn out in the future. And they're really powerful as a tool to help us prepare for a diversity of future conditions. And I'll just say quickly that it's quite flexible. It has been developed and used across a lot of different sectors very recently in the natural resource management realms, like, as we'll hear today from Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service, but also in private industry and military applications too. So I'll just talk quickly about one flavor of it that we have applied, as I said, particularly with the National Park Service. And it really begins for us with the resources that a management unit or a management partner cares about. What are the things that they plan around and that they put their budget and resources and staff time into? And those, what we call focal resources, then are the basis for identifying the aspects of climate that are most relevant to that site in those resources. So what are those parts of climate? Is it spring precipitation? Is it minimum winter temperatures? What are the climate variables most relevant to a given place and resource? What are the range of conditions we could expect for those particular metrics? And based on those uncertainties, we can then develop a small set, usually 3 or 4, sometimes as few as 2, scenarios, storylines about how those climate conditions, those combinations of conditions would affect resources for a given place. And importantly, we don't stop there. We use those stories about how the world could turn out to test management strategies to ask, if the world turns out like this, is a management unit set up for success? Are we going to be able to meet our goals with our current activities? And if not, how can we refine them? How can we make changes to our goals or our activities or both so that we can be successful under a range of different conditions? So just to kind of wrap up here, we found that climate change scenario planning really facilitates open-minded thinking about a manageable set, not a daunting set of future conditions. And we've seen that it can address planning needs for lots of different types of resources, from cultural resources, natural resources, infrastructure, and so on. And in some cases, yeah, we do it in a participatory qualitative way, but sometimes we bring in quantitative ecological or hydrologic models to help us get a deeper or more specific understanding of climate impacts. But perhaps most importantly, I think, is climate change scenario planning is most impactful when we tie it to an existing or ongoing management planning or decision-making process. And so I'd argue that that's really important connection that we should try to make if we're going to be using scenario planning. So I'll stop there. My email's here. I can drop it in the chat. I know that was quick, but hopefully gets us all sort of on some same footing for further discussion. And with that, I'll ask Imtiaz to jump in here and pass it over to our next.
Thanks, Brian.